many people, including myself, don't have time to spend 45 minutes eating a single carrot or a cashew or whatever. But we can pay attention when we eat. As long as we have at least 15 minutes, which is the time it takes for our body to kind of register, we can pay attention as we eat.
So, Dr. Jud Brewer, great to be with you. Welcome to the Commune podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so congratulations are in order for your new book, The Hunger Habit. I know that gestation period is long and difficult, so well done. You've been brewing up another microbrew in your brew house, or however you think about it. So
thank you.
Well done. So I look forward to plumbing the depths of habit creation and emotional eating, and how we can apply many of these neuroscience principles to overcome and, I suppose, change our negative relationships with food. But, given that this book really does build atop the shoulders of much of your prior work, I was hoping that just to lay some compost, if you will, for the conversation, you could give us a little survey of your personal and professional forays into the world of mindfulness, and how you came to start to apply that to the topic of food habits.
Sure. Well, it was certainly a long and winding road, so I won't take you down that entire road, but maybe we'll hit some highlights and some viewpoints along the way. First, this is a very unexpected journey for me, and I think often when we follow the unexpected, we are rewarded, so much more than if we just follow the narrow and beaten path. So when I started medical school, I was pretty stressed out, and I started meditating on my first day of medical school, and was just doing it as a, stress reduction measure. And I found that, during medical school lectures, I could, pay attention to my breath, and I felt like I was getting something useful done, ironically, because in the Western mindset of doing more practice. And long story short, when I spent about 8 years starting to learn to practice during my MD PhD program. And, you do these programs where they split it up. You do a couple of years of medical school, and then you do your PhD for long enough so you forget everything you've learned in medical school. and then you have to go back on the wards and are expected to pick up with the other third years, who've just come right out of second year. And so I did my psychiatry rotation as my first foray back into the hospital, because I'd forgotten how to interview patients. And I was like, wow, this is fun. And, kind of blew it off. Never thought I would end up becoming a psychiatrist. Long story short, I'm a psychiatrist. And in residency, I'd been doing all this molecular biology research. And I really made this conscious decision where I really loved what I'd been learning about the mind, and felt like there was an opportunity to do mindfulness research. This is back in the early aughts, and very, very little research had been done at the time. And I remember somebody telling me I was going to kill my career. Literally, he said this, a fellow resident. And he said I was going to kill my career if I did this stuff, implying, the candles and unicorns and all this stuff around mindfulness. And I remember thinking, well, I'd rather kill my career doing something that I'm passionate about than succeed, doing the normal stuff. And so that kind of set off the trajectory of like taking the cold plunge into doing mindfulness research. And it kind of built from there.
Yeah. Okay. So I wonder if you just could give us a kind of a working definition for a mindfulness practice, because I think it'll come in useful as we start to kind of pull apart the hunger habit.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I think of mindfulness as a large circle, and then within that think of a Venn diagram where there's a smaller circle that fits entirely within the larger circle. And I think of that as meditation. And I use that as a framework to start, because often we think, oh, mindfulness is about meditation. And really, there are very many different definitions of mindfulness. And I think I like to keep things very pragmatic. So it's really about two elements. One is awareness, and one is this attitude of curiosity, being curious. In Zen, they talk about this don't know mind, or beginner's mind. And here, in Western mindset, a lot of people have heard of Jon Kabat-Zinn, who developed the mindfulness-based stress reduction program. He talks about non-judgment as an attitudinal quality. That's really, that's a positive framing of non-judgment is curiosity, when we're not going in with preconceived notions. And so we can think of, being aware in a curious way when we're sitting meditating, but we can also think of this as being mindful or curiously aware anytime when we're going through our daily life.
Yeah, in the book, since you bring up Jon Kabat-Zinn, you give an example of the raisin experiment, I believe, or I'm not sure that's the right moniker for it, but yeah, we can maybe poke at that at some point, because I'd heard about it, but I'd never heard it described in such colorful detail. So I really enjoyed that bit. There also just seems to be this element of metacognition related to mindfulness, this ability to observe and witness one's thoughts and feelings without getting swept up in them or identifying with them. And I think as we come to examine the nature of habits and how we might reframe or recreate new habits, it seems like this concept kind of punctuates a lot of your suggestions here.
It does. And so I think one way to think of this is, in physics, they had this term they called the observer effect. And they coined this when they were trying to measure the mass of electrons. And the only way they could do that was by inferring their mass based on their momentum. And they could measure momentum by hitting electrons with photons. And so the idea was that by hitting an electron with a photon, you actually had to take into account that interaction. And they call this the observer effect. And basically it means by observing, you're affecting the results. So the only way they could observe was by hitting an electron with a photon, and they were affecting the results. So they had to take that into account. In psychology, they call this the Hawthorne effect. By observing. So imagine doing an experiment, like, you're asked to go and be a participant in a psychology study, and they say, oh, move this pencil across the desk this way. And if they stand over your shoulder and watch you with a notepad or something, you might do it slightly differently than if they were outside of the room. And so, they actually found this, I think it was based on a suburb of Chicago, where they were doing some experiments in a lighting factory. And by observing the workers, they were seeing results that ended up being affected by the observations. And I say all of this because we can use this knowledge to see how we interact with ourselves. So often we are identified with our thoughts and our emotions and even our body sensations. We think, oh, that's who I am. And that identification actually colors our relationship, not only with ourselves, but with the world. And so we're going to interact with the world, and we're going to interact with ourselves in a different way when we're identified with a certain thought than when we can be curious and just observe it as a thought. And so I think of it this way, the act of observing affects the results. And that, that can kind of be a precursor for how we can actually leverage the strength of our brains to change habits. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think as we kind of cultivate some of these practices as well, they do help to create kind of that space in the classic Viktor Frankl sort of way between stimulus and response, such that we have a greater ability, to witness thoughts and feelings as passing phenomena arising in society moment to moment and not identifying with them. And, as we begin to attack some of these entrenched maladaptive habits, that can come in pretty handy. So let's just dive right into the neurobiology of habits. I mean, can you describe the various neural machinations at play in respect to habit development, and how we seem to become very entrenched in some of these kind of maladaptive, kind of settled practices, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying probably 95% of habits that we have are actually helpful. And so often we talk about habits in terms of getting rid of unhelpful ones, but I just want to give a nod to our wonderful brains that are set up to help us survive every day, and actually to help us free up space to be able to learn new things every day. So imagine if we had to, if we didn't know how to walk or put on our clothes or make coffee, we'd be exhausted by the time we even made it to breakfast. And so setting up habits helps us do things that are helpful generally, so that we can open up that space to learn new things every day. So just a shout out to our wonderful brains for this survival mechanism.
Before we put it on trial.
Yeah, exactly. So the way that it works in the systems, there's a well-known neural pathway or a circuitry that's described as the reward-based learning system, or the reinforcement learning system. It involves brain regions like the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, things like that. Even the prefrontal cortex, we form memories, involving the hippocampus. And then there's a part of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex that helps kind of arrange, or it sets up what I think of as a reward hierarchy of how, which behaviors we pick over others, so that we can make decisions quickly every day. And it's a pretty simple process. It has 3 key elements to set up any habit: a trigger, a behavior, and from a neuroscience standpoint, a reward. And so, imagine our ancient ancestors foraging for food. When they found some food, there's the trigger. They ate the food, there's the behavior, and then their stomach would send this dopamine signal to their brain that basically said, remember what you ate and where you found it. So it's really set up for us to learn, basically context-dependent memory, so we can learn where to find food again. And the same is true for danger, right? We can learn where food is, we can learn where danger is, we can go to the former, we can avoid the latter. And these processes in modern day are called positive and negative reinforcement, because they are the very foundational habit formation process, and couched under the term of reinforcement learning in general.
Mm-hmm. So let's say there's a cue or a trigger that is not necessarily a biological imperative, but an emotional state. How can that then start this kind of domino effect that could lead to, let's say, emotional eating or eating our feelings?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So here, think of it as the general categories are positive and negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement means if there's something pleasant, we learn to do it again. Negative reinforcement basically means if there's something unpleasant, we learn to avoid it in the future. So with, let's say we go to our first birthday party when we're 5, and we start eating cake, or the first time we've had ice cream or something like that, our brain says, wow, this is really good. This combination and this concentration of sugar, salt, and fat is amazing. It's actually called the bliss point, where you can actually dial that in. And so we learn, ice cream is good, or cake is good, or whatever our favorite food is good. And then when we're, let's say that we're frustrated or anxious or sad or lonely or bored, all of those tend to fall under the category of negative emotions. They don't feel good. So our brain says, hey, this doesn't feel good. And then it says, remember that ice cream? Ice cream tastes pretty good. So if I eat ice cream, I can make the unpleasant feeling of boredom go away because I'm eating something pleasant. So this is the negative reinforcement process, meaning, let's say we're bored or we're sad, and there's the trigger, we eat the ice cream, there's the behavior, and then we learn to numb ourselves out or avoid that unpleasant feeling of boredom or sadness. And then that gets reinforced to the point where, these things are called stress eating, or, comfort eating, or emotional eating. And in fact, this is so common now that scientists have had to come up with an actual term that's called hedonic hunger. And it's a term because it's not actual hunger. So they just had to name it that to characterize what this was. But it's actually eating in the absence of hunger based on an emotion, as compared to homeostatic hunger, or physiologic hunger, which is the actual survival mechanism.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I suppose this reward that we get is quite ephemeral, right? So we might
Yes.
get that. I think you call it a spritz of dopamine, which I like that um, vocabulary there. And but of course, before you can close the box up, this dopamine hit has worn off, right? And so
Mm.
then you're left with yourself again, right? So that those
Mm-hmm.
negative emotions re-emerge. So there you are once again, lonely or sad. But through repetition, these neural pathways in the brain have become so strong and efficient that then you just go back to that same subconscious or bottom up behavior of just eating another pint of ice cream or
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
equally maladaptive. Is that a fair understanding?
Absolutely. And there are a couple of elements to highlight there. One is the more quickly we learn to find that quick fix, the more intolerant we become of negative emotions. And so
Mm,
if we
mm,
can, if we learn to scroll on social media or check our email or run to the refrigerator, the more we do that, the harder it is to actually sit in discomfort. And so many people have lost this ability. It's called distress tolerance, right? They have a very low tolerance for distress because these things are at their fingertips.
yeah, and I suppose the sort of overabundance of kind of this surfeit of cheap calories, it doesn't make things any easier. Um,
Well,
in that
especially when they have
regard,
a half life of about 1,000 years, so you could always have something
that's
in
true.
your
Yeah.
desk drawer that's going to be edible. Well, at least not rotten.
Yeah, well, maybe pull on that thread for a tiny bit because certainly our food industry, I mean, really any industry that becomes commodified under the general aegis of capitalism sort of falls under this same trend, I suppose. But how the food industry kind of insidiously works to entrench these habits kind of beyond their normal means.
Yes, and again, it's if you look back at the conditions that were laid down to make this possible for the food industry, it's not like somebody woke up one morning and said, I want to make stuff that is very addictive and terrible for people so that we have an obesity epidemic. Go. You know, it starts with like a corn subsidy and then makes high fructose corn syrup very cheap. And then suddenly people are looking for profit and they say, well, I can make cheap stuff. And, soda, oh, that's dirt cheap. And we get high margins on that. Let's sell that. And how can we outcompete the other people? And so, it's just people getting stuck in a capitalistic system
Yeah,
that,
yeah. It's not the people; it's the systems.
yeah,
Often, yeah, right.
yeah. So I just want to highlight that. And, it's unfortunate when somebody's like, well, I got to go make a buck. And then here are the industries that are hiring, they kind of get stuck in the system themselves.
Yeah, but you mentioned the bliss point. So there are very intentional efforts to kind of engineer around that bliss point. Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct? Yeah.
Yes. And, if you look at just an example, RJ Reynolds, tobacco company, I don't remember when they first acquired a food company called Nabisco, but if you look at the ticker tape, I think it's RJRNAB, RJR So it's like, when they started getting in trouble in the 80s, when the gig was up around tobacco, they had to diversify their portfolio. And they're like, we have a bunch of engineers that can engineer things that go in, that get ingested. Let's start doing this with food-like objects, to the point where, my favorite peer-reviewed journal, The Onion, they had a headline that says Doritos celebrates its 1 millionth ingredient, just kind of highlighting or poking fun at how highly engineered these things are.
Yeah. Well, reality seems to have put the Onion out of business these days.
I know, it's unfortunate. I love The
Yeah.
Onion.
I loved the Onion. And it was free, and it was during kind of my college years, and so.
Hmm.
Uh, but it's hard to kind of hyperbolize on top of hyperbole at this juncture. um, um, so just to kind of hover back over, um, why we eat. So at the beginning of the book, you describe, I guess I might call like a satori around why people are eating, because you yourself have never, I don't think, struggled with weight management, um, but you were working with, certainly with a lot of people in groups that had this as a kind of primary infirmity. So what was the kind of the light bulb moment that went off for you, that people are really eating not because of a biological need, but more because of a psychological desire, I'd call it?
Yeah. So one of the light bulb moments that I had was around, I was in my clinics. I had set up a group medical visit for people with binge eating disorder. And so I was working with, it happened to be all women at the time, but was working with a group of women. And I felt like I was missing something when we first started this group. And I was like, I'm losing something in translation here. And I had this assumption that people could tell when they were hungry. Let's put it that way. And one woman at one point said, "Oh, I have an urge and I eat." And my assumption was, well, that meant she was hungry. But I stopped and I said, "Wait a minute. Well, is it because you're hungry?" And she looked at me like I was crazy. She's like, "What do you mean?" "I just have an urge and I eat." And then everybody in the group just was chiming in. It was like everybody's like, "Oh, finally he understands." And the idea there is when we start to mix these wires in our brains between homeostatic and hedonic hunger, then it's really hard to tell the difference with what signal is what. And that was actually one of the first places that I started to explore, like, how can we rewire the brain, but use the brain's natural reward learning circuitry to rewire itself.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. You, because you're walking this tightrope between kind of modern neuroscience and, in this case, relationships with food, and mindfulness in Buddhism, and kind of that pedigree. I think you refer here to the hungry ghost. What is the hungry ghost?
Yeah, there's a concept in Buddhism, and it may be in other traditions as well, but I learned it from a Buddhist context. So you can picture a ghost with a pretty small mouth, or even a normal sized mouth, but a long, narrow esophagus and a huge stomach. And so if you look at it in terms of uh, being able to get enough food in the belly to make it satisfied, that ghost is set up for failure. There's no way it's going to be able to fill its belly, because with that esophagus, it prevents food getting in there enough and quickly enough that it can fill it up. And so they call this the hungry ghost, because it's this, and you could think of it as the hedonic treadmill, where we keep trying to shove more food into our mouths to fill ourselves up. And it only makes that phenomenon, makes us more hungry, more and more hungry. And so I think it's a beautiful description of what we experience when we're constantly trying to soothe our moods with food.
Yeah, and it speaks to this, to the core of suffering, right? So, this notion of Trishna, or thirst, um, that seems to underwrite this idea that, like, if only and only if I can get that glittering thing that's out there, well, then I'll be sated, or satisfied. And then, of course, as soon as we get it, there's another glittering object that appears right on the horizon, and we've forgotten about the thing that we have, and now we're off to chase, you know you know bridge the next that chasm to the next thing. And of course, then that's where the treadmill comes into play, right? And so this is a phenomenon that happens, obviously inclusive of food, but also with almost any object that appears to assuage our discontents, or perceived deficiencies, right? um,
Absolutely. Yeah, it's like we're being sold salt water as a thirst quencher.
Yeah, without the desalination
Yes.
plant
Yes.
handy. Um, okay, so and it's fair to say that this idea is or this phenomenon is really very, very prevalent. I mean, this isn't just codified to like a small niche group of people. We look at um, society. I think there's like 75 or 80% of us are overweight or have issues with weight management in the United States. I think the rates of obesity are maybe 44% at this juncture, and this obviously we have an absolutely crazy, unrealistic sort of Instagram fed version of what beauty is that contributes to this pathology. But then there's also like separating that with the actual underlying kind of physical, pathology that, this is contributing to this kind of what might be initially an emotional issue is actually contributing to a lot of physiological suffering.
It is. And I think there are several contributing factors here. So one is that we have these societal norms that somebody set up and now we're perpetuating, that we've already been good at comparing ourselves to other people and to ourselves, and then you set up social media, which is like the perfect mirror where we can suddenly compare ourselves not just to the people around us but to everybody in the world. So it's a terrible mechanism for guilt and shame and self-judgment, right? So that's not helpful. And we've tons of studies, I won't go into them, showing, especially with teens, that this is extremely problematic for self-esteem. So we've got that. And then we've got, that's on top of the already established societal norms about what we should look like, and all of the underlying judgments around fat people, for example, lazy, this and that are in there and then these folks get microaggressed all the time, where people are, they're just feeling this judgment, whether it's in the workplace or at the grocery store or anywhere else, So all of those, then you add in what we talked about earlier, which is these hyper processed food like objects, or even food that can be heavy in carbohydrate content, for example, that can then get associated with comfort, where people are feeding their wants and learning to feed their wants through marketing or whatever, as compared to meeting their needs. And nobody's, it's hard to make a buck off of connection and true connection. And so, it's much easier for a company to sell a product, to get somebody to buy something, as compared to saying, hey, put your phone away and go talk to your family member, or take your dog for a walk, or go, hang out with your neighbor.
Hmm. Yeah. And it appears that a lot of this judgment that is levied against obese people, which then turns into a lot of shame, is built atop the apocrypha of willpower, right?
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this is a bridge into kind of what typically doesn't work to reframe a negative relationship with food, because you unpack this with great eloquence in the book.
Yes. So this reminds me of the Lay's saying, "Bet you can't eat just one," which I didn't know until I did a little bit of research on the book, um, which was that slogan came out back in 1963, which was the same year that Weight Watchers was founded. I'm sure that's a perfect setup for a conspiracy theory, and I'm sure somebody will come up with one, because that's just what people's brains do. But it was probably a coincidence, and that slogan is so good that we know it, and it's probably still used today. But the idea there is that you're setting up this perfect storm for the food industry that says, hey, we're going to learn better ways to engineer things to be addictive. And Michael Moss did a great expose. I think he wrote a whole book on this, but his expose came out in the New York Times back in 2013 on, on the, I think it was like the extraordinary science of addicted junk food or something like that. So that's there. And then you set up an industry that says, hey, let's use your willpower to help you lose weight. So Weight Watchers was set up actually, I think, by a woman in New York who happened to be a housewife at the time and was struggling with her own weight management, and had tried something through the New York City public health or something, and it hadn't really worked. And so she sets up this, Weight Watchers, which, becomes probably the largest, weight loss program. And the idea is, use your willpower. So they have these weekly meetings, they have weigh-ins, you get cheered if you lose some weight. It's eerily silent if you don't, hence, shame and guilt as a way to try to motivate people to, just do it. But the paradox here, if you look at it from a neuroscience perspective, is that all of this, so to put it gently, willpower is more myth than muscle from a neuroscience standpoint. If you put it cynically, it's a perfect setup for a company to sell you stuff because they can say, the formula is correct, right? In medical school, I learned calories in, calories out, right? The formula is correct. Okay. But the assumption is that there's something wrong with the person, not the formula. So if it's a diet plan, just follow our diet. If you can't follow the diet, sign up for another year, because it's your fault. And so there's more guilt, more shame. So that's what we're fighting against as people. Yeah. And the bottom line there is, it's really that we haven't looked at it from a neuroscience standpoint and asked, well, how does the brain actually work? And is willpower part of the equation? And the short answer is no. Willpower is not even in the equation for behavior change from mice to humans. It's not there. So neuroscientists don't waste their time with this concept of willpower.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think that it violates some basic instinct that many people have when they look at folks that might be struggling with their weight, and the judgment is like, oh, well, they're just lazy, right? They're not really like applying, they're not disciplined. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence for that on a neuroscience basis.
Right. And so I want to highlight that for anybody out there who thinks there's something wrong with them. There's nothing wrong with you. It's not that you need more willpower. I would suggest, just take a little time to get to know how your brain works, and you're going to be able to leverage your brain much better than beating yourself up over failing yet again with willpower.
Yeah. And you give a number of examples in the book about how trying to kind of self-impose discipline, tends to end up with not being particularly profitable. So, you talk about like the abstinence violation effect, and there's a few other ones that I found kind of interesting, sort of denial increases desire, and a few other ones. So can you talk about some of those myths?
Yeah. So let's start with the simple one that I'm sure most people have heard, where it's like, what we resist persists, or, the denial increases desire. And so the idea is, it's probably started whenever we were a kid and our parents said we couldn't have something. What did we want? Whatever they said we couldn't have. So our brains say, "Ooh, now I really want that." So that, we can see how problematic that is. And then on top of that, when we try to deny ourselves something, it's kind of like the water is building up behind the dam, and eventually that dam is going to burst. And this is Alan Marlatt coined the term the abstinence violation effect, I think back in the 1980s. And he was an addiction researcher. And the idea was that when somebody kind of forces themselves not to partake in whatever the substance is, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or whatever, it doesn't matter. As soon as they can't take it anymore, my patients call it the F-its. They're like, screw it. I'm going to go ahead and I'm not only going to smoke one cigarette, they're back to a pack a day in no time, or they're going to go on a bender with alcohol or some other substance. And so, that our brain says, I haven't had it for so long, I want even more of it, even though that might not actually feel any better, but that's what our brains do. They say, I'm going to do it all. There's a movie. Have you seen the movie Chocolat? old movie.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. It was. I have to see it again because I remember thinking that it was wonderful.
Oh, it's so good, so good. So many great. It was just beautifully written. Johnny Depp, Juliette, what was it? Binoche. I probably got her last
Oh
name
yeah,
wrong.
right.
Um,
Jeanette or Binoche.
there, I think so,
Yeah,
something like
right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, she
So
was. Yeah.
anyway, the premise is that this movie is set in a small French town during the time of Lent, and in the with the north wind, this woman who's I think her name is Vivienne in the movie flies in, and she's got this red cape. She's signifying the devil, temptation, right? And there,
Mm.
and the pious mayor signifies willpower, and goes through all Lent trying to deny himself of all the pleasures during Lent to show how strong he can be. At the end of the movie, spoiler alert for somebody that just really wants to watch this, I don't think it's going to spoil the movie. He goes in to basically destroy. So she sets up a chocolatier, if I've pronounced that correctly, and she's selling chocolate, and all the townspeople, they're like, "Wow, chocolate!" And the mayor's like, "Come on, that's evil." And so at the end of Lent, he goes in to destroy all this beautiful chocolate she's made, and this little splash of chocolate lands in his mouth, and like he goes nuts and just starts, abstinence violation effect galore, where he goes nuts and just starts eating and eating and eating. He passes out after eating so much chocolate. And the morning of Easter or whatever, the young priest in training walks down the street and like wide-eyed and sees this guy passed out in the chocolate display, like just covered in chocolate. But that's the abstinence violation effect, to a T.
Yeah, yeah. I suppose you don't need to look too much farther than the Catholic clergy for proof that denial increases desire. But in any case, I love those French movies where seemingly nothing happens, for 90 minutes, but you're just lulled into the countryside. I have a little special place in my heart as a Francophile. So I think the other thing that you addressed that I found interesting under the kind of category of things that don't tend to work is this kind of world of biometrics. So, and this is an interesting time for this because there are increasingly like commercially available Aura rings. I actually wear a continuous glucose monitor and all these kinds of things that people can, and there's this kind of emerging term known as orthorexia, this kind of unhealthy obsession with health and food. So
Note
why
the
are
irony there, right?
yeah yeah
Your obsession with being healthy is such an obsession that it's unhealthy.
yeah, well, you'd be surprised how many people I know that fall into that category. And my kids often accuse me of that sometimes. So, why is focusing on particular measurements why is that tendency might not take you to the promised land here?
Well, and this isn't to say that measurement is inherently bad. I think the analogy here is that our smartphones are a tool, and it's if we learn to use them wisely, then they can be very helpful. I cannot navigate the streets of Boston without my phone. It's just a mess, and so very helpful. On the other hand, I could be addicted to my phone, and constantly checking social media or whatever. And I think the same is true with these biometrics. So right now, and they will get better, but the inherent concern is still there. So one, if we're just doing simple things like tracking our calories or tracking our food intake, it's hard to be accurate. And it's also hard. There's no one size fits all. We're very individual people. Our needs, our caloric burn, all these things are totally individual, and they can even vary from day to day based on what our activity is or our environment is. So we try to mush everybody into a single box and say, oh, you need this number of calories, you need this number of, if you break it down. And so that's a problem. Two, the other concern is it's hard to track. It's like, oh, here's the food label and I could scan it or whatever. But these things still aren't great at doing a perfect estimate of what the calorie is. So even the tracking part is problematic. It'll get better, but it's still problematic. So then you add to that, and this is the biggest problem, which is we're learning to divorce ourselves from ourselves instead of listening to the wisdom of our bodies that have evolved for such a long time to tell us exactly what we need. We're suddenly saying, I don't believe you. My calorie counter says I can eat this much more. And the body's saying, yeah, I'm actually not hungry right now. And so then we start to cross our wires in the service of being healthy, but with the results of being unhealthy.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, so good. There, it's funny that, like, I was wearing an Aura ring. I was suffering from chronic insomnia for many years, and I changed a bunch of protocols and got it under control. But there was a time there where I would wake up and I would rely on the app to tell me whether or not I got a good night's sleep,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And and then I started listening to Alan Watts. He has this kind of like little parable about like how we, always confuse the symbol of things for the actual underlying reality. So
Yeah.
we confuse the menu with the food, or the map with the actual territory itself. And I was confusing, my app readout with actually how I truly felt in my body. And you actually do.
Well,
It's
it,
crazy.
yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I wrote a little bit about this with my wife in the book because she at times has gotten addicted to tracking stuff, and she has a watch now that we both have watches that do a surprisingly good job of differentiating different sleep cycles. And so it used to be, we wake up in the morning, we say good morning, give each other a kiss. Now it's wake up, and the first thing she says is, "What was your sleep score?" And then we get the kiss, and so it's like,
Yeah.
but it's a not necessarily a competition with me, but like with herself, because she got a 99 the other day. I'm like, oh god, she's never gonna beat that, right? But it's like,
Yeah.
but this just
Right.
highlights, how we can get so, and I'm like, well, how do you feel? But my
Right.
sleep score said this. Well, how do you feel? Do you feel rested? you know,
Right. But I think, and you point to this in the book, is that it gives us this feeling, if a false one, of control. Right.
mm-hmm.
So we like that. There's a tendency to think like, well, what I can measure, I can improve.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it separates us, as you say, kind of from really the process of being alive, of this organism and its vacillations and fluctuations. And you actually in the book, and this can maybe bridge us into kind of some of the solutions here, is you do a wonderful kind of body scan meditation, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a way to become more just aware of how we're feeling. So what is that for people that are unfamiliar with that?
Yeah. Well, and this is kind of set up to help with, anybody that gets stuck in this metric. And I love this. I teach this in one of my courses at Brown, which is there's a phenomenon called the Goodhart's Law. I mentioned in the book briefly. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And the idea is that we distance ourselves from our bodies. And even James Joyce wrote about this in a short story where he said, one of them called a painful case, where a guy named Mr. Duffy, and he says Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. And the idea is, and this is back in 1914 that he wrote this story, right? So it's not just with the modern metrics that we have and the biometrics that we can lash to ourselves, but this is something that we as humans have tended to do for a long time. So if we are not living in our bodies, if we're distancing ourselves from our bodies, one of the first steps is to kind of reconnect with our bodies. And the body scan is a practice that was popularized by I think he was born in India, S.N. Goenka, who was actually a prominent business person who had these chronic headaches, if I remember correctly. And he went to this Burmese teacher, Uba Khen. This is back in the 40s, 50s, something like that. And learned to meditate to work with his headaches. And then he developed this very standardized meditation practice that's called Vipassana, which literally means seeing clearly based on these teachings. And he's famous because he has these 10-day retreats that are very standardized that you can find anywhere in the world. I actually took one in Kathmandu back when I was in medical school. And you can go on retreat and you can do what he calls the body sweep, or in Western terminology, John Kabat-Zinn calls it the body scan, where we're basically scanning, bringing awareness to, as we scan from the head to the toes or toes to the head. And we're just noticing physical sensations and being curious about them. And that simple practice is a way to kind of re-engage and reconnect with our actual physical sensations from moment to moment. It also serves many other purposes, but the basic premise is that it just starts us in the process of kind of learning what our body feels like from moment to moment.
Yeah, are there specific physical cues? And I asked this question in relation to that body scan kind of self-experiment. Are there physical cues that help us delineate between kind of emotional hunger and biological hunger? Like, for example, like, does your stomach grumble, when you're emotionally drawn to food?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so the short answer is there's a lot of overlap between homeostatic and hedonic hunger. So if you think of the Venn diagram, there's probably more intersection between those two circles than there is non-intersection. So stomach grumbling is a good example because that's one where, unless we have a extremely strongly conditioned response to a certain food, that's one that is generally reserved for homeostatic hunger, for actual physiologic hunger. Whereas things like restlessness is highly overlapping between the two. Lack of concentration could simply be that we're distracted by something, or it could be that we're actually hungry. So there's a lot of overlap that makes it really challenging to tell the difference between homeostatic and hedonic hunger. Fortunately, there are some ways that we can weight, we can weight the different variables, so it's like, if we've just eaten and we're feeling restless, and we've eaten enough, it's probably not because we're hungry. Whereas if it's been 6 hours, so we can do things to give preference to the signals that we're starting to identify and say, okay, that lack of concentration, well, if I haven't eaten in forever, I'm going to make that higher likelihood that that's actually homeostatic hunger, especially if my stomach's grumbling and there are other signs that go along with it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's, you've laid out a 21-day program in the book, and you do that with a grain of salt, because you also
yes,
you also sort of tear down the 21-day myth while you're also doing it, which is I find to be honest and humble. But let's get into some of the primary pillars, of this program, and how people should execute around it.
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that forward because, I get this so many times. How long does it take to break a bad habit or start a new habit? And they're like, isn't it 21 days? And I say, well, a guy wrote a book in the 1960s. He was a plastic surgeon, and he observed that it took his patients about 3 weeks to get used to their new nose jobs. If you want to extrapolate that to your own experience, go for it. The truth is, it depends on the person. It depends on the habit. It depends on a lot of things. And it probably has very little to do with plastic surgery. So I just wanted to highlight that because that is the prevalent myth on the internet around habit change. And there are actually very few studies that have looked into it very carefully. We actually did a study with we have this app called Eat Right Now, and we could actually measure the change in reward value, and we can bookmark what that means for a minute. But we could actually measure how many times somebody did a particular mindfulness exercise around overeating for reward value to change. And it was about 10 to 15 times. Now, it's not like somebody's going to overeat 10 times in one day. So usually that's spread out over time. but it does highlight that we can change a habit pretty quickly as long as we pay attention. But let's footnote that, because the general premise or the general arc of change that we've seen, we've done research over a decade now with this, whether it's smoking or cigarettes, eating, or even anxiety. We found that there's this 3-step process that seems to be pretty consistent with habits in general. So the first step is just identifying what the behavior is. You can map out the entire loop. What's the trigger, the behavior, and the result? Or you can even just focus on the behavior. With eating, am I eating because I'm hungry? Am I eating because I'm bored? I'm stressed. I'm lonely. I'm anxious. There could be all of these hedonic things that trigger us to eat. And so we have to first identify, I like just asking the question, why am I eating? Right. And feeling into our experience. And sometimes that can take a little while to get reconnected with our bodies to see if we're actually hungry or not. And that's where things like the body scan come in. So that's the first step. And then the second step is where we're actually leveraging the strength of our reinforcement learning system. And instead of trying to use willpower, which isn't even in the equations for behavior change, we're starting to ask a simple question, which is, what am I getting from this? So why am I eating? Step one. Step two, what am I getting from this? And what that does is it leverages this orbitofrontal cortex that is determining how rewarding a behavior is. And I think of that as set and forget. When you set a habit, you forget about how rewarding it is. You just do it because you're going to automatically, that's what the definition of a habit is. You do something automatically. So we have to bring that into conscious awareness and then reassess how rewarding it is right now. And so if we bring that into conscious awareness, 3 things can happen. One is it can be more rewarding than we have set that reward value at. It's called the positive prediction error. It can be less rewarding, or it can be the same. If it's the same, we don't change. If it's more rewarding, we're going to do it more. If it's less rewarding, we're going to do it less. Concrete example, and this is a learning process, right? So let's say there's a new bakery that opens up in my neighborhood. I don't know how good their chocolate cake is. So if I eat their chocolate cake and it's the best cake I've ever had, positive prediction error, I learned good bakery, right? Go back here. If it sucks, I'm like, meh, they got to get their act together. I'm not coming back here. I've also learned, right? And so both ways I've actually learned. And if I don't pay attention when I'm eating the cake, I haven't learned anything. So that's the process of change, is paying attention when we're doing a behavior. And the simple question that we ask ourselves is, what am I getting from this? Not thinking I shouldn't eat 3 pieces of cake, but feeling, what's it like when I eat that third piece of cake versus the second versus the first, especially when we're not hungry, right? And that's what we found when we did this study. 10 to 15 times of somebody overeating, they realized pretty quickly that it doesn't feel good. Their body is telling them everything that they need to know. They don't need to check their app. They don't need to track their calories. Their body's saying, dude, did you really have to eat that third piece of cake? Seriously? Like, because there's a rock in my stomach right now, and I think that's cake rock,
Cake rock. In order to undercut the appeal of negative behaviors, it seems like the step before that is to cultivate that space, that attention, really, to be able to ask some of the questions of, like, why am I doing this? How do I actually feel? And in a way, is the reformation of habits sort of putting more weight on the top down side of the tug of war? We have these bottom up behaviors that are sometimes, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation, they're sometimes very adaptive, right? Mm-hmm. So very helpful. Sometimes not, sometimes very maladaptive. Yet they're still kind of bottom up. They're involuntary because of all of the reasons why we've discussed. And is some of this really being able to sort of leverage our prefrontal cortex, our neomammalian capabilities, to essentially put pressure, top-down pressure, on bottom-up behaviors, such that our voluntary behaviors eventually become involuntary?
I would say no and yes. So I'm going to start with a no. And there's, I don't know what the anatomy of the Vulcan brain is, but I would say yes, for sure, with Mr. Spock, because he basically had all prefrontal cortex, right? His famous line was highly illogical, Captain, in Star Trek, right? And so Mr. Spock could just logic himself out of anything. And I love Star Trek in many ways, but one was that Mr. Spock was the antithesis to Captain Kirk, who was emotional, right? And so, this is where Danny Kahneman's, famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow comes from, is this idea that we've got these two brain systems that are fighting with each other, and it's the emotional versus the logical. And it turns out that the logical, while very logical, is extremely weak compared to the emotional. And so for example, it's the prefrontal cortex is the first part of the brain that goes offline when we get stressed or when we're anxious or when we're hungry, or you bring, that's that hangry saying when we're hungry and angry, or we get angry because we're hungry, and so we do these habitual things when we can't rely on our prefrontal cortex. So Mr. Spock came on. The rest of us, I would say, leverage the lower. And what I mean by that is we have this extremely well-evolved, very strong emotional and habit system. And the idea is we need to we need to learn how to train it. And if we can learn how to train it, it becomes the new habit. And the way to train it is not by trying to force ourselves or do the mental push-ups or the shoulds, but it's really through just bringing awareness on board. And that's what that second step is all about. If you look at, Rescorla and Wagner were these two scientists in the 1970s that came up with this formula that my lab still uses today for habit change. And the idea is you bring awareness in, you see if something's rewarding. If it is, you're going to keep doing it. If it's not, you're going to stop or you're going to become disenchanted. None of that requires willpower. The only training piece that's needed is awareness. You just have to pay attention as you do it. And you can also reflect back on times when you did it in the past. You don't even have to do it again if you've done it enough where you can reflect back and kind of feel into what it was like, what the result was in the past. That's why I like the simple question, what did I get from this? And not in a thinking way, like I shouldn't have eaten those 1,400 calories. It was, what did my stomach tell me?
Right. Interesting point. Does the disruption of context stability play a role in kind of unwinding habits? And I mean, do you have to go to the new bakery? Do you have to force yourself to go to the new bakery? I mean, oftentimes, to break habits related to drugs and alcohol, for example, people and food, but people are often kind of sent off to somewhere to essentially break context. Is that a crucial element of it, or maybe not really?
So it's not crucial because I've seen tons of people do it without changing context. Two, that tends to be a privileged thing. So only a certain number of people can actually go out of context, get childcare, have their job, give them leave, all those things. And the other piece there is that I've seen this, I can't tell you how many times with my patients with addiction. They go into rehab. They're like, oh, great, I don't have any cravings. Well, their brain's pretty smart. Their brain's like, there are no drugs here. There's no alcohol here. I'm not going to bother craving. But guess what? As soon as you get out, I'm waiting. Yeah. I'm going to crush you. I remember a guy, this was on a residency. There was a case of a guy who'd been in a therapeutic community for 1.5 years. And as soon as he got on the train home, he was calling his dealer. 1.5 years. So, yeah. So sometimes it can be helpful for somebody just to break, if they feel completely out of control, they just got to hit the reset button somehow. And maybe rehab is helpful. Some type of a context shift for a little bit isn't helpful, but critically, that's not going to work unless you learn how to work with your brain. Otherwise, it's just going to be a temporary measure. And then you're going to wonder why you failed when you went back to your old context. Well, the system is really failing you because they're not training you to work with your brain.
Yeah. So we touched a little bit on mindfulness, and how would you define mindfulness as it pertains to the action of eating? so we hear a lot about mindful eating.
Mhm.
What is that according to Jud Brewer?
Well, there are a lot of conceptions around mindful eating where it's like, and this goes, maybe we can talk about the raisin exercise, because this is this famous thing with mindfulness based stress reduction. It's kind of a rite of passage for a lot of people where, somebody's first introduced to the program on the first day, they pull out this object and they're like, oh, the teacher's like, oh, I'm going to put something in your hand, just hold on to it. They go around the circle and it's like this sacred object and it's a raisin, right? And you're supposed to hold this raisin and then you're supposed to like look at the raisin and listen to the raisin and, smell the raisin and do all these things, and then you slowly eat the raisin. And the idea is you take 30 minutes to kind of break the cycle of what most of us typically do, which is just to eat raisins by the handful. And the whole idea there is like, oh, if you slow down, you pay attention, you can actually notice things. Shocker. When you pay attention, you notice things. So that's kind of the stereotype when people want to make fun of MBSR programs. They're like, "Oh, did you do the raisin exercise? Did you take 45 minutes or an hour?" Well, in reality, I think of mindful eating as just paying attention as we eat. Many people, including myself, don't have time to spend 45 minutes eating a single carrot or a cashew or whatever, but we can pay attention when we eat. And so as long as we have at least 15 minutes, which is the time it takes for our body to kind of register fullness, it's, we can pay attention as we eat. And so we can really just, what's it taste like? What's it smell like? We can enjoy the food and we can see what we prefer, what we don't prefer. And so the big thing is just putting away distractions. We're not eating while we're watching a television or a YouTube video or checking our email or scrolling through social media because we're not actually registering what we're eating, how much we're eating, etc. But it's really that simple. It's like, pay attention as you eat and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's also an argument just for good digestion and metabolism of your food to be paying attention. I mean, if you're essentially staring at the invective of Facebook, which is designed algorithmically to essentially trigger your negativity bias and activate your sympathetic system, such that all the blood is flowing away from your stomach when energy should be focused on digestion. It's probably not the best way to get the most out of your food. But you actually brought up in the book an interesting instance. I think it maybe surfaced on a discussion group or something where someone asked the question, well, like, what if I'm in a social situation and I'm super engrossed in the conversation and and I'm like, can I still eat socially and be involved in a conversation, but also eat mindfully? Because how am I going to pay attention to like every contour of the raisin?
Right.
Right. If I'm trying to have a conversation with Jud.
Right. And so I'm glad you bring that forward because I see this so often. And the short answer is it's hard to do two things at the same time. And the longer answer is, how many of us spend how many of our days in social situations eating? It's a lot. It's a lot of time. So we can learn to try to balance those things where it's, if we tend to overeat, we can pay attention and check in with ourselves before we get the food. Like, how hungry am I? What was it like when I ate this much last time? Can we, if we know we're not going to pay careful attention as we eat because we're going to be really engrossed in conversation, we can pay attention beforehand. We can also pay attention afterwards and ask, well, what did I get when I ate that much or that type of food? And we can still learn from that because after, at the end of the night, we can, how well am I sleeping? How's my stomach feel? All of that can be good information. And we can also, there are always going to be lulls in conversation. So we can spend time like engrossed in conversation. And then we can take a minute to, and even say it to our, compatriots and say, hey, this food looks really good. I just give me a minute to like actually taste this and enjoy it. Nobody's going to be like, no, don't enjoy your food.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's also kind of modern forms of grace. I'm not an Abrahamic guy, but so you're not going to find a lot of grace at our table in the classic sense. But we do have a ritual called Rosebud Thorn. I have three daughters, and they're all home now for break. And at dinner time, we talk about the rose, the bud, and the thorn of our day, kind of metaphorically. And that's kind of our form of grace, where we just settle and we listen and we become kind of aware. All the phones disappear, all that kind of stuff, all the other forms of distraction kind of just disappear. And it's a way of honestly just kind of quieting the body, and paying attention. And I won't say that we don't like woof down in the enchiladas from time to time, but we do appreciate it. And we take our time. But I think that I think you do a good job at kind of pointing to some of the myths of mindful eating, in the book, where mindful eating doesn't have to be slow eating. It doesn't have to happen by yourself. It doesn't have to be this kind of dirge, this chore. I mean,
Yeah.
which I think mindfulness often gets put in that category. Alan Watts has this kind of idea of like, meditation, it should just be grooving with the present, grooving with the present moment. This is about having fun right here, right now. But it often gets kind of couched in the kind of parentheses of, a chore. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe we can pivot it and talk a little bit about kindness, because this is one of the more unexpected pieces of the book. I think where okay, we're going to apply some of these neuroscience principles. We're going to become more mindful about our food, and now, but then this other ingredient of kindness seems to be a very novel concept. So, what role does kindness play in the equation here?
Yeah, and kindness in itself is not novel per se, right? So if you look at any spiritual tradition, right? And I know you're not saying it that way, but when it comes to ourselves, especially in the Western world, I think it is a very foreign concept, because we think you just got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You got to be mean to yourself. You got to, judging yourself is the way to get stuff done. And this goes back to our brains, where our brains love to make correlations, and they assume causation or causality when there is none. So correlation does not equal causation. And so the idea is, well, when something isn't going well for us, if we just tell ourselves to do better next time, or we beat ourselves up, or we self-deprecate, we associate that with doing better, or at least doing something. And the research hasn't shown that actually works. It can actually just get us stuck in self-judgment habit loops. So here, with kindness, I think of it as, so if we think of these three steps, what's the behavior? First step. What's the result? Right. That's the second step. What am I getting from this? And the third step is like, what's better? So I think of this as finding the bigger, better offer. And so if we spend our lives judging ourselves, and then, for eating amount or type of food that we do, or not being a certain way, that actually can just create more shame and guilt, which then feeds these cycles of judgment. And so if we simply ask ourselves, well, what feels better, judging myself or being kind to myself? Then kindness wins every time. We've even done studies on this. We haven't published these yet, but basically, it's pretty universal that our brains prefer kindness over self-judgment, or, anxiety, or, being mean to ourselves. So it's in there, and we can simply feel into it. And using that comparison can help us start to develop kindness as its own new habit, as a bigger, better offer, because our brain, given the choice, it's going to start choosing kindness over meanness, because it feels better. So it's a great way to approach our habits with regard to eating. And also, as a bonus, it can become a new way of approaching life.
Yeah, I mean, there's a meditation practice known as metta. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, you're very familiar with it. It's generally associated with this notion of sending loving kindness externally, to as an act of compassion to assuage suffering. But is there a practice, a metta practice that's more focused around sending kindness to yourself?
It depends on, so there are a number of ways that this has been taught in the commentaries. But if you go back to the Buddhist teachings, the description of metta is around a mother holding her only child. And so I think the commentaries tend to make it sound more of a dualistic thing. Like, I'm going to send kindness to you. Maybe I'll send kindness to myself, this type of thing. But if you look at those, they're kind of phrases that help us warm up to the feeling of kindness. But really, if you look at the early teachings, and I'm not a scholar, but this is just how I understand them, is that they're really about awakening that feeling of that open-heartedness. And that open-heartedness is non-dual. It's not about us being open-hearted to somebody else. It's not about us being open-hearted to ourselves, because that's still dualistic. It's just about feeling into the feeling of open-heartedness, which then breaks down those dualistic boundaries of us versus others, us versus the world. And it's just resting in that awareness of openness. And so here I think of it as, if you really go back to the core teachings, at least the way I understand them, the commentaries can help us start to awaken those qualities of experience, but they are, again, can become fingers pointing at the moon as compared to the experience itself. So once we find that path to awaken our hearts and open our hearts, then it's there, and it's really about that feeling, that experience, as compared to a more of a cognitive process.
Yeah, so interesting. I'm sort of tempted here to go down the Buddhist wormhole, but if you look at kind of these experiences that seem to be kind of at the apogee of what it is to be alive, um, joy and compassion, this notion, Buddhist notion of mudita, for example, like joy simply for someone else's joy,
Mm-hmm.
but kind of above that, a non-dual form of joy, that is just joy for the sake of joy.
Yeah, yeah,
um, or the identification of someone else's suffering as your own, this notion of like karuna or compassion,
yeah,
that it isn't just, it isn't dual in the sense anymore between, it's like someone else's suffering and your suffering, or it's just a feeling of wanting to relieve suffering kind of generally, and
yeah.
it is an experience that is mystical, I suppose, that it must be felt and not cogitated.
Well, I would say let's take both of those. If I would love, just even for a minute. So if you look at the experience of joy and you approach it from if I put my neuroscience hat on, we can compare. What's the near enemy of joy? Is it envy? I think, if I remember
Mm.
correctly, they talk about things that are close to these immeasurables but aren't them, and they can be false idols, so to speak. And so, if I remember that correctly, I think it's envy, jealousy, maybe something like that.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is we can compare, like, if something great happened to somebody, if our reaction is that we're envious, we can notice what that feels like. And that tends to close us down. I want that. Right. So there's a wanting quality that comes into that. It makes it, and there's a dualistic perspective. They have it. I don't have it. I want it. When you look at and we can ask ourselves, how's it feel when I'm envious? Well, it feels lacking because I don't have it. Whereas if we just feel into the quality of joy, like somebody's joyful, I'm just doing this right now. It's like, oh, it feels so good. Like
Yeah.
when somebody's just like so joyful and you're like, oh my God. And it's contagious, right? It's like, even now, just remembering, I'm like, oh, it doesn't even matter what it is. It's like so contagious. And it's interesting. They call these four immeasurables, right? Because they build on themselves. They're not limiting. There's no zero sum. It's actually, it becomes bigger and bigger the more we tap into it. So then we can ask, which one feels better, to be envious or just bask in the joy? It's a no-brainer. To do the same thing with compassion. I think of this as, and I do a lot of work with helping physicians not burn out. And what first thing I work with is like empathy versus compassion. So empathy, in a nutshell, like putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, it's feels closed down because somebody's suffering. Now you're suffering. Boy, that sucks for everyone. Whereas if you don't take that suffering personally, but you notice the fact that someone is suffering, you can feel into the pain. And thankfully, as humans, our natural response, maybe unless we're a sociopath, is like, oh, there's suffering here. And then we want to help. But if it's not about us protecting ourselves from that pain, then we can open to it because there's nobody to protect. And we move into this non-dual space that feels better than empathy, than getting sucked into the pain. So even from a neuroscience standpoint, it's beautiful. It works beautifully with the experience, whether it's mudita or karuna, or whether it's joy or compassion. Our brains are just wired this way. It's so amazing.
Yeah, and this can play itself out just on the most anodyne, quotidian, Instagram-y kind of way. I mean, how many times do you essentially project your own unfulfilled potential onto someone else, through their accomplishments? So, okay, someone now has put out a bestseller and they're trumpeting it all over some Instagram post. And, what is your response in witness of that? Is that envy? Or is that just like, oh my God, that's so great. I'm
Yeah.
so joyful and happy for that person.
Yeah.
And then you can ask yourself, what served me? Like, what did I get out of this?
Totally.
And it can be quite enlightening.
To go use a Buddhist analogy that I love, this, and maybe it's in other traditions as well, it's kind of like if you pick up a hot coal and you try to throw it at somebody, even if you hit them, you're still getting burned. And that's what envy is. It's like we're burning ourselves. Or the Confucius saying, if you go out on the journey of revenge, dig two graves, or something like that, right? So the whole idea is that all of those things just create suffering for ourselves, regardless of how it affects the person, that we're sending the dagger-eyed look at, for getting that bestseller or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I will certainly be joyful when your book is a bestseller. How's that? And yeah, The Hunger Habit, it's out, at the end of January, right around the time of the airing of this show. So I'm very excited about it. And what else do you have going on? Because I know from your book, you're mindful and also move fast. So I can't imagine. I can imagine your life is quite full when you get back to Brown, etc.
Well, certainly, the spring semester will be starting. But one thing we've been doing is we just started a nonprofit for addiction treatment where we're bringing together some of the digital therapeutics and the neuroscience that I've been working on the last couple of decades to train peer support specialists and really help support the addiction community. As an addiction psychiatrist, I've witnessed, the opioid epidemic that is still ongoing and raging, and we're getting other epidemics on top of it. So doing a lot of work in the nonprofit space, or for anybody that's interested, the nonprofit's called Mindshift Recovery. I think the website's just mindshiftrecovery.org. So that's a place where I'm spending a lot of time just trying to be of service.
Beautiful. Yeah, I have a lot of friends in the recovery space that are bridging recovery from addiction with kind of somatic practices.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of yoga and movement, etc. So maybe we can connect some of those dots there. I'd like that. And if you're ever in the warm climes of Southern California, you have a kooky retreat center to hang out at with compost and bees and chickens and the rest of it. So I hope to see you there.
I would love that. Thank you.
And I hope you can catch a few waves in the meantime. I know you're, I'm sure this surfing is part of your mindfulness practice. I'm not a surfer, but everyone who I know who is, that's always the equation there.
It is definitely a mindfulness practice, and to be fully transparent and honest, it can be very addictive. You never know when you're going to catch the next wave or how good it's going to be. So it's a good practice with regard to working with craving as well.
Yeah,
and
sure
joy, right? It's like if I'm as stoked about somebody else catching a wave that I didn't catch, game on.
There you go. The Brahma Vihara as set atop of surfing. I love it. All right, Dr. Jud Brewer, it's been an absolute treat. I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about. So if you're good with it, we can just say to be continued. And the hunger habit. So happy to support it. Where can people find you and keep abreast of your work?
I'm on Instagram at dr.jud, Dr. Jud. Also have a Dr. Jud website, drjud.com. Those are probably the two places where they can get more information, and got a bunch of free resources on the website there as well. So yeah, probably a good place.
Great. All right. Thanks for all your work, and I'll see you soon.
It's my pleasure.
Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.